Good morning and welcome back to the Explicit Measures Podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Hello, everyone, and
Hello,
good morning.
Mike. Good morning.
For those of you who are trying to listen on LinkedIn, I'm going to send you a quick message here. For some reason, the stream is not working to LinkedIn, so I'm going to throw down just a little quick note here on LinkedIn for those of you who are trying to follow us on LinkedIn. For some reason, LinkedIn's not connecting to our streaming platform. Oh, well, figure it out. Kind of how we roll here.
Well, we're on YouTube.
Tuesday, gentlemen.
We're on the podcast as normal. So again, if you're just listening and subscribing, nothing that we just said applies to you except for the Happy Tuesday. What was
We
that?
do want you to have a happy Tuesday.
I mean, it was almost cut off, Tommy, which would have been a huge faux pas.
Huge
faux pas. A huge faux pas, but it's all right.
I think we survived. We made it.
Okay, all right. This is good. A wang bang of a start on a Tuesday morning. Get the juices flowing. Any intros to cover, Mike?
So anything you guys found kind of interesting coming across the items here? I think there's something that's coming down the pipeline here that's kind of going to be a larger impact to what you're going to be able to do. For the first time ever, Tommy has discovered a README file that appeared at the Microsoft Power BI desktop samples over on GitHub. Tommy, you want to explain kind of what this is and what you found?
Yeah. So I have a little RSS feed for GitHub notifications, and it looks like there's a new update 5 days ago on the README called Report Theme JSON Schema. This is from Microsoft, the GitHub repo. And it was basically like, hey, this folder contains JSON schemas for Power BI desktop, which we've never had before. Before, if you wanted to know what was in a particular property or object, you had to look at either David Eversell's or Matt Rudy's or PowerBI.tips. But basically what they've added here is this JSON schema that you can add with VS Code, and basically would auto-populate the right properties and validate whether or not your JSON theme file is accurate, correct, and will work in Power BI desktop. So this is pretty cool.
There's always been a challenge because no one knows what any of all the theme properties are and making sure that they work correctly all the time. So this is the first time we're seeing anything from Microsoft come out with a standard or something that they're going to use to vet your JSON schemas against. So all of this is going to be interesting because I think this is going to create two problems. One, it's going to find a lot of files that people were just kind of mucking around with, and it's going to, help them figure out where the issues are. And then the other thing is, I think it'll make it easier for people to consume and build tools on top of whatever the schema is.
Yeah, I think the part with the I think it looks like they're gonna have more than one schema file, but then you can just reference it in your theme file. You basically say, hey, the schema that we're going to use is the official schema, and it's going to allow you to basically say not just what you can choose from, like what objects, but then what those with the switch statements or what the values are. There is one thing though at the very bottom of this README that I was a little concerned with, and it says, currently we do not support the following items in the custom report theme JSON, which I don't know if means in the schema or moving forward, but one of them is the references to dynamic content that reports support, other than theme color expressions, etc., which is very much what the Chicago user group was about and what the Power BI theme generator by PowerBI.tips does.
That's different though. They're talking about theme color data expressions except colors. So you can do an expression-based coloring. So colors that are based on the color palette. But it's basically saying like sparkline. You can't do an expression based on a sparkline item. They're not going to support those inside the theme file itself. So I read that as, yes, you can use expressions that are used in desktop, but when you're editing theme file, they're not going to accept those theme file options inside of the spec.
I see, because they must have just made this update on 5 days ago, because I think I sent this to you, and initially it said that you couldn't use anything that was a reference to the
I haven't been watching this page very closely. I'm not sure exactly what's changing on there over
looks like
the last
something
couple days.
bunch, yeah.
But it's good. I think it's going to be a good tool, kind of help people move along. Excellent. With that, I don't really have any other intros. Any other kind of interesting articles that hit you guys across this week? I'm gonna try.
Not on my end.
I think I just I mean, I think I found like there was a service administration one that I found very interesting. Oh, Data Meerkat came up with an article talking about data flows refreshing and monitoring data flows through your Power BI tenant. So I'll throw this other article here as well. I thought this was a really good article on just talking through how do you monitor a data flow and where can you get the data from that, and how could you monitor critical data flows when they're running inside your organization. People are kind of a mixed bag about data flows. They work well in small data batches, but if they get too large, they seem to not be too effective. There seems to be other tooling that you could use more effectively. So here's the link from Data Meerkat talking about monitoring your data flows and the refreshes of those data flows and monitoring that as well. Oh, this was a good article, very well written, good instructions. Daniel has got a great, or sorry, Stefan is the one who's putting this one out. Oh no, won't let me put the link down there now. Let's try it again. Hopefully it'll work this time. Okay, hopefully it went through. There we go. Another good article around monitoring your data flows. All right, with that, we can go into kind of a couple quick announcements here. We have a couple upcoming events coming around the ecosystem here. We have SQL Bits coming up on March 14th through 18th. It's at the ICC Wales, and you can get a 5% discount by using PowerBI.tips 5 to register for the event. Go visit SQLBits.com, and you can get your tickets there. Another great event is the Global Power BI Summit. You can visit globalpowerbisummit.com. This is a global event. It's all virtual, and it's going from March 6th through to the 10th. And it will be another great event around talking about leaders and experts from Power BI, talking about what's happening in Power BI, teaching, education. I think I'm doing like a 101 of visuals, so giving you kind of like the high level view of what visuals and how to build them. And I think with that, those are our two main key sponsor events. All right, let's get into our riveting topic of today. We'll jump right into what is DataOps. So I'll give maybe a little bit of an intro here for everyone, because this is kind of one of the topics that was kind of near and dear for my heart. Thinking through what is DataOps, how does this work, and what does it mean for our organizations? I think we've talked in the podcast a lot around, we are kind of, as a data developer or Power BI developer, we're kind of somewhat of those, you're kind of the middleman. You're the person in the middle that is, I don't really own the data all the time, and I own the output of the report, but we're kind of passing things through. We're doing some modeling, we're getting data together, and often I feel like the data that I'm given, the person who's delivering the data is saying, yeah, it's all good, no problem, data's clean, ready to go. And then I get this data, I'm like, well, did you know there's a whole bunch of blanks in these columns? Did you know there's a whole bunch of missing values here? Or did you know that you had like 3 different types of date time field columns? There are 3 different times in the date field, you have 3 or 4 different ways you're handling dates. Some of them are with letters, some of them are with numbers. Like you're doing the word of March, but then other times you're using the number 03. So sometimes there's a lot of cleaning that needs to happen before we get into like the final model and build it to our Power BI report. I feel like DataOps, and I feel like it's been a buzz term a bit more frequently here recently. I think it's been around for a lot longer, but I think in the recent time here, DataOps is becoming a bit more interesting to people, and thinking about how do you generate data in a regular and routine way. I'll pause right there. You guys have any thoughts on DataOps things?
So
Wow,
this
okay,
is
great.
relatively,
No.
yeah.
Good
Wow,
job, guys.
wow. My
Wow.
goodness.
Okay.
Tommy opened his
Those are
mouth
really
with like a and then just
All right,
like hung
close
there.
your other
so-
browsers. Focus on the podcast. There's actually
I
people
was
listening.
waiting.
Tommy,
I
for
was
once.
sure Seth was going to go first, and then there's a
Well,
pause.
leaving the
So
leaving the door
yeah.
open for you.
This is a relatively
guys.
new topic for me, or we'll say concept. But as we've kind of been diving into this, it's pretty much as an approach or methodology for a lot of the problems that we said. There's a really great book or ebook out there called the DataOps Cookbook, I believe, or the DataOps Cookbook, and I'll put the link in there. And it really talks about what is the values, how does it merge with DevOps if you're used to that, or Agile. For those who've ever worked on anything project based, that you understand this phases, requirements, iterations, and it really goes into what do we do from process, approach, and technologies that can help translate some of the software Agile methods from what we do from a data quality point of view. Now, that being said, obviously we're wanting to relate this or see how much we can apply this to a Power BI and the Power BI developer. A lot of it seems to be like from a code testing to data, like from maybe we'll say more on the back end, a little on your front-facing Power BI desktop and reports, but very much on the business logic on what would be happening from the ETL side. So I'll be interested to see what you guys have to say.
Well, I think it is that, but at the same time, like, did we post the blogs from John Kursky? He's been, for one, shame on me. Like the first time, just prepping for this podcast is the first time I've come across his blogs. But he's already got 25 about how to integrate DataOps principles into Power BI. So definitely, like going to spend more time there in digesting how his approach is to taking these principles and applying. So I don't know if it's strictly just like back end, because in the ones that I was able to get through, he's integrating them as much as he can into the Power BI ecosystem. I think what's interesting is, to me, to like Mike, to your point, there's the testing, right? There's the unit testing almost of ensuring data quality that comes through reporting, but a lot of the data ops principles, I think, are designed around, like we've said, DevOps, where you're creating a pattern of deployment that is consistent and can ensure a better, higher quality product every single time. And that crosses the boundaries in Power BI because it's a tool that's designed to be very low code, right? And front facing. So
Yes.
I think it creates significant challenges in the unique position it has, which is in multiple houses in an organization. You have very novice end users getting value out of it. You have power users. You have individuals in the ecosystem that just continually learn and advance in using Power BI and gain benefits of using the tool. And then you throw it into the enterprise space, where we talk a lot, because that's like technically where I live a lot. And Mike, you're building solutions, in big data. So all of a sudden those become part of the framework too. And it is much more challenging than just DevOps, I would say, because typically speaking, like DevOps you have a specific environment and there are deployment strategies and there are unit testing, and everything is automated from a deployment schedule perspective. And whatever's released into these different environments has been structured, organized, and designed to be repeatable. And trying to apply those kind of rigid gates into an ecosystem where Power BI has no mechanism to be rigid in a lot of cases. So all of a sudden, these automated principles are now manual steps, which is interesting to me. In my first kind of brush at this topic at a deeper level, is my initial concern is that, are we trying to create like, do we have to create too many manual steps that are actually creating a really challenging deployment for us if we implement them all, versus DevOps, which should be a very structured, all of your efforts are in automation to release a product that's better.
I will admit, I mean, having a team of people who on my team who work in app dev, I pretty heavily pushed my team to make sure that we learned good practices around DevOps and doing like a repeatable, fully automated way of getting code out the door for applications. So that's something that we know how to do it. It's a little bit harder to figure out. I mean, not everyone understands how to do a continuous integration, a continuous deployment pipeline, but it's a very needed skill, I think. And to your point there, Seth, the more you can automate, the more efficiency you can gain from and confidence you can have in whatever it is, right? I'm just talking about app dev for now, but like, if you overlay that same level of rigor on key data sets, I think it really helps, honestly, from a reliability and making sure that you have tests that prove the data hasn't changed. And I think, a couple areas here I would additionally add on here, Seth. I think as you talk about data ops, right? When we think about good practices in the cloud, I think what we're finding is there's easier ways to, and I feel like this is for me, and this maybe other people may have different impressions of this as well. It's easier to integrate Git repos with cloud-based tools. I think it just seems to be simpler, right? It's easier for me to write an ARM template and just deploy the infrastructure that I need. On-prem, it's much more difficult. Maybe you have backups and deployment scripts that are working there as well, but I feel like on-prem, it's a little bit more challenging. I think the cloud space seems to lend itself a bit more to automation. It just seems to be a trend that I feel like I'm seeing. So that being said, if you can build the infrastructure with code, if you can deploy the Jupyter notebooks or your engineering of the code to produce the data with GitHub or DevOps as well, it makes sense to start thinking about, okay, well, how do I bring that full type of like rigor and processing into the data piece as well? What does that look like? And I think Power BI by itself doesn't do a great job of helping you build your own data ops. And I don't think I've seen any frameworks inside Power BI that do a good job. So this is one of the things I think is a challenge here. I mean, this might be more a challenge to the community. John Kursky is like the only article that I've seen that has a really rigorous way of like going through data ops based things. But like, I don't see a whole bunch of stuff inside the community right now talking about the rigor of going through your data and making sure that it's regularly deploying correctly. And I'll give an example of what I think people are going to try to, or people want. Like, for example, here, imagine you have a data model, and in that data model, you have certain characteristics of like a fact sales table, right? And for each month, there is a certain number, a dollar amount that you are interested in being able to track over time. So you're going to obviously make changes to this data model over and over and over again. And you're going to add tables, you're going to add new measures, all these kind of things, right? So at some point, you're going to want to go back and say, okay, did this model change? Did I break anything inside the model? It's easy to remove a relationship at some point and make stuff fail. It's easy to somehow accidentally not load data correctly for your row level security. And if you're looking at the row level security for a single user, making sure that that's deploying correctly. So I think if you looked at your data model and said, what are the most important things of my data model, and tried to pluck off, a handful, 4 or 5 things that are very important, you would want to run a single query that says, okay, select all of the sales, the total sales for the entire, year of last year, and just give me a single number, and just check to make sure the number's right. So you have to kind of like document that somewhere, and then you have to run that test. And so the idea is, okay, every time I deploy a model, part of that deployment pipeline would be, okay, run my tests at the end. Okay, last year's sales, 221 million. Yes, it doesn't match. Okay, it matches, good. All right, so at least that part, we have the data inside the model. It seems to be correct. And you could do a number of permutations on this, but I think where I'm going with this is to have a regular and easy to use framework that makes it easy for you to run those tests is the hard part. Because
so you're talking specifically on the back end with the data, though.
That could be, well, even in the model though, like the model's deployed, right? So I'm talking, there's a couple places you can do data ops, right? You can do data ops and this is, I think, where maybe not the confusion comes from, but I think this is where we are borrowing from some of this terminology. You can have data ops on the back end in the SQL Server. You can have data ops inside machine learning or data ops for data scientists. That they do a lot of data ops as well, making sure that their data is coming through correctly. And what I think I'm trying to communicate here is you really want to have the ability to be able to write tests against your data models and prove that it works. Now, I think what you were asking, Seth, is, yeah, this is probably occurring outside of Power BI, right? This is not, there is no PowerBI.com deployment pipeline thing, right? Is that kind of what you're mentioning there?
No,
or
what I'm driving at is your description of what you keep referencing as data ops, I think is a part of data ops.
yes,
Like you're
it's a piece
talking
of it,
about
the testing
testing and
portion.
automation of data, right? Of making sure that the data is accurate.
Correct.
Which, I mean, ultimately is exactly what we like. I think is paramount in the reason why you would implement data ops as a process and set of practices, et cetera, or as a a full rollout would be because your primary goal is to ensure that your data is accurate and you have like consistency and trust in all the reporting that you have. But I think let's. I'm not going to back up a little bit, but
Okay.
I do want to lean into the cookbook, right? Because it's new to us, I think it's worthwhile. And you can tell me to shut up if you don't think so. I think it's worthwhile to go through the principles of data ops.
Yeah, let's do that
for the audience, right? Because a lot of these I think are consistent in themes that we've talked about.
Okay.
But at the same time, maybe like I'm not saying we divert from what we want to talk about, but ultimately just lay out like what does it mean by data ops, right?
Yeah.
So first and foremost, continually satisfy your customer. I think all of us are in agreement there, right? Like
100%.
obviously that's the goal with any of the insights and reporting that we're doing. Value working analytics, and this is where I think a lot of what you're talking about relates to, not just the insights that are delivered, but incorporating robust frameworks to ensure that we have accurate data, right? And that is, to your point, in multiple systems. Like,
Correct.
do we have checks and balances in the source?
Yes.
Then I can compare against my checks and balances in the model, right? Because that's a completely different framework that we've now ingested. We've got filter criteria set up on pages. We've got a bunch of different things that could affect the data output. Is it producing the results that we would expect it to? Then it goes on to embracing change, welcome evolving customer needs, embrace them and generate competitive advantage, most looking to drive effective and efficient agile methodologies in communication face-to-face with the conversation. So like, are we consistently talking to the business stakeholders? It's team sport, daily interactions, self-organize, reduce heroism. And I think that was a big one for me, right? Like, their description there is, as the pace and breadth of need for analytic insights ever increases, we believe analytic teams should strive to reduce heroism and create sustainable and scalable data analytic teams and processes. And I think John Kursky, in one of his blogs, talked about this, where they were using DevOps principles. They had created a report that was going to be the decision maker for some pretty significant business decisions. So executive team, meeting, and they went in, and one of his people had the foresight to like capture a screenshot or several like informational screenshots around the data model and where the data came from, because the thought was they're going to question where, like, can they rely and trust on the data to make these big decisions, and that person was ready with that information and could bring it up in the meeting. And that's the type of like heroism, because what would have happened, I think he outlines what would have happened if that person wasn't there, right? You get into, and tell me you haven't been here, right? Like you get into an insight.
Is it right? How can I trust it?
Somebody goes,
where'd it come from?
How can I trust this data? And you're like, because you should, like, so it brings up that conversation of how do you reduce that? Well, if we know inherently that a report user is going to question where data comes from, is it a golden data set, right? Like, have we told the organization that you can trust this. We have rigor around these data sources. We've, put our stamp of, seal of approval on this one. It's good to go.
Yep.
Or in the report itself, is there some sort of link back to where they can look at a particular data catalog or where the data is coming from and know that it's good, right?
I think this is
that would
important.
be, I think, something that he brings up, which is take away these like parts of heroism, and they should be part of your DevOps process or your
Yes.
data ops process.
I think you also have to remove, like in this case, in this situation, particularly for that example, it's really around removing people's excuses to not use the information, right? I think, I mean, in my engineering days, right, if I was going to produce a part or make something, I would produce it, and then I'd have to provide factual data, like, hey, this is a test I ran to prove that this thing would work. Like if I expect this part to run 1,000 cycles, well, here's the test that ran 1,000 cycles. Like the part worked, no problem. It actually ran 2,000. So like you provide evidence back to the audience of like, here's why you can trust it. Here's the tests I did. And we would write up full like test descriptions. I'm going to test it like this. Here's my assumptions. Here's my, you kind of write up those things. Not saying you have to do a full write up on everything, but I would also think as you look at more governed data sets, as they become more important, and to your point, Seth, like if it's stuff people are making just, critical decisions on, one of those would be like the sales team bonuses report, right? Whatever that one is, right?
Yeah.
That's going to be a report that everyone's going to scrutinize. Well, I'm going to make sure it's going to be exactly right because everyone's going to have questions like, well, that doesn't look right. How do I know this number's correct? I didn't do that many sales. That wasn't my customer. That all these kind of questions will come up, and be able to have, tests or things in the background that says this is the story of the truth. I think you need a couple of those projects to be wins for people to start trusting the information that comes out of the team. But to your point that you're making is if there is a need for that level of rigor, it should be just part of the process. It should be built into how you do data.
Well, unfortunately, we are very limited with Power BI, at least when it comes to built-in testing or really testing at all. John actually has like a DataOps template in GitHub, but it's still not necessarily that flexible in terms of if you wanted to test a model, like a unique model and being able to create the testing for there. But I want to touch on, there's a whole other side of when we're talking about not just the principles, but when we're talking about DevOps and agile development, that I think we can apply more from what a Power BI developer or Power BI team's doing day to day. The testing would be great if we could set that up in a automated and a simplistic way. Right now, it's not something simplistic. It's either PowerShell or Python.
I disagree. I think there's ways to get around that. I don't agree with the fact that it's not 100% automated, but you can, at a bare minimum, you can set up a metrics report. You can know what a number is. You can pluck a number off a report page. So what is a test? A test is going after a specific point of data in a report with some sort of filter context applied to it. Like an example I gave earlier today. What is the total sales of last year? Great, that's a number. You could literally go to a metric scorecard, pluck that single KPI off of the model. So as long as you have a card inside the data model, you can pluck that single data point right off of that report, put it in your metric scorecard, and then you can just type in what the number really is. So to me, that's great because now I can then look at that number exactly and build. I mean, that's part of the process now. And every time the report refreshes, it'll always get that number.
Yes.
Like that's what a test is, though.
That's a test, but that's still over one data model or one data set.
But I'm not saying you want to do it on every report either. Okay. So like, again, yeah. I think, to blanketly say you need this on every single report or every data model you're ever going to produce, I think is a misnomer. I don't think that's, if you think that way, I think you are missing the point of what Power BI is, because it's like self-service BI to some degree. So there's no way you're going to be able to cover every single report coming out for every part of your organization with data ops. It's just impossible.
No. Hold on. No. Once again, data testing and setting up automated tests on a data set to ensure data quality can't be done on every single model. I agree with that. I don't agree with the statement you made, which is data ops can't be applied to every single report. from the standpoint that it's much more than just how rigorous you are with your analytical testing, because part of this is also how you deploy your report into an ecosystem. It's part of the process.
Are you talking about governed, or are you talking about ungoverned? I think you're. So I agree with you, Seth, in the governed space.
If I'm talking about like governed, meaning the BI team, right? Like,
yeah,
absolutely, right? Like there
agree
is
with
what
you
I'm
there.
my argument with you is, or with the statement is, if I'm going to invest a lot in the data ops process, part of that is how do I produce reproducible or consistent reports? Does it mean I have to do every one of these like in depth to the umpteenth degree when I launch a report? Absolutely not. I don't think so. And
that's, I think that's my point, though. I think my point is you're going to have some reports that are coming from the central team.
But my point is words, right? You're talking about testing of data and data accuracy, which is a component of a report, which is part of data ops. It's not data ops.
Yeah, it's a part of it. Correct.
Right. And that was my only point. You said, I'm not going to apply data ops to every single thing. And I'm like, no, we would. We just may like pick and choose depending on how much time it takes to put something out the door for a particular use case that you might say, this is a new thing. I'm not going to apply everything I did for this other model. That's for the executive team versus something internal. But the structure would be the same.
I agree for the central BI team, but I'm saying, like, if I step back and zoom out at the entire organization, every single person inside organization, there's going to be so much content created without any of that consideration.
Like none of this conversation, I think impacts any of that.
Yeah, but that's my point, though. It's like, I think people lump Power BI into this like single bucket, like, oh, if you say data ops, it has to be on every single thing and Power BI related. And I think it's an expectation you can't even hold that.
We're also touching a subset though too of what data ops is, and I think where Power BI probably has a better light in this rather than, because we've really been focusing on the testing. So in the data cookbook, and also I know John goes over this as well, there's like the 8 challenges data analytics faces and how data ops approaches it.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe with that, he probably wasn't thinking about this in terms of Power BI specific.
I'm sure he was. I'm pretty sure he wrote. That's exactly what it was.
Everything.
Yeah. Not John.
Every blog is bringing data up to Power BI.
Exactly.
That's from John.
Like he probably had Power BI.
The article from John, the book was written by Christopher. So there you go. Christopher, Gil, and Eric.
I heard you say
yeah. But there's like the challenges and basically goes through the approaches. And I think there's probably more here that we can explore or kind of further develop. So for example, some of the challenges data analytics faces, changing requirements.
Yes, 100% agree.
Yeah,
all the time requirements are changing.
Disappointing users, poor quality, low ROI, and
data's going to live in silos. Yep.
Yeah, and so it basically goes over what data ops, and the whole other side outside, even if you forget testing, honestly, there is the having that agile method, having a requirements list or feature requirements list. Users get features quickly. You actually you go through a dev test prod, or you go through the, like, what is he called, a value pipeline or innovation pipeline, which basically can be more, maybe wasn't necessarily exactly tied to a Power BI report, but something we should definitely do. I've been in a space where we tried to do the exact Scrum method towards Power BI development, every 2 weeks and have
deliver something.
And at the time that didn't really work. And I don't think, because it was trying to do exactly what the DevOps team was doing, the software team was doing.
Why didn't it work?
Because with the 2 weeks, the deliverables were, this back in the day, we wanted to say, like, have a report, turn out a report. Here's a help desk ticket. Those tickets should be done. So really going through, I think what really should have been modified and where it could have worked is when you have those requests, when you have, what are those iterations going to be? What features are going to turn out? And I think doing a better job of that feature request list.
So
we're modeling that.
I would say, like, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I was going to ask, I didn't understand why it didn't work. It didn't work because the goalposts kept moving. The requirements kept changing before the 2 weeks were up, and so therefore wasn't able to get a report out. Is that kind of what you were saying?
Well, it didn't work because in terms of what the features of what the output was, it was basically like, oh, there's a request, so you should basically finish those requests within those 2
Yeah,
weeks.
no,
Right.
That's so fundamentally, like, one of the biggest pieces for data ops, I think, that I can immediately glom onto is orchestration, right? Like, understanding
Mhm.
what data tools you're using, when you can get done with things done, and that's communicated to the business, especially when you start to add in a lot more layers into a development cycle or a data ops cycle. You have to have justification for why you're doing those things to the business. And when you go through like your Scrum methodology and why it failed, you're outlining the fundamental things that you're not implementing in those practice, or you didn't implement in those
Right.
practices, which DevOps does. If you think about how it gets through the cycle of whatever you're using, whether that's Jira or some other management cycle, like, you have an idea. Typically, it comes from product. The equivalent of product is our end user, albeit depending on who's making the request, like, they're not going to know all the information that you need. What product does is they have to like come to a grooming where they outline the needs to the team. The team estimates how long they think it's going to take to do it, and then it gets scheduled, right? There's a back and forth between the technical teams and the business side teams to level set expectations. It is not what business loves doing, which is, here's a request, here's the deadline.
Right.
No, that's not how it works, because what you don't understand is your priority is not my priority. So
Mhm.
I have 5 other reports that come behind this, and I'm more than happy to reprioritize those if collectively the business says that that's a good idea, because there's a finite number of resources that can do a finite number of jobs, or whatever. And that's where getting out ahead of these things, in terms of, here's a request, here's the process you follow, here's how long it's going to take, then you as a team can say, I have 4 months of work to do. Any new request that doesn't meet these priority thresholds is not going to get done in this time. I have a problem. I can't execute on all of this stuff in the time frame that it makes sense. We need more bodies, or whatever the case may be. But if you don't have that dialogue,
Yep.
and you don't have that structure, that, like, this is exactly why you introduce something like data ops into your organization, and saying the orchestration piece first of, like, how do I manage all these requests, is probably, I would say, the number one place that makes the most sense to control the chaos. Because what you
Mhm.
described, and I know this by talking to you a lot
Yeah.
in your past, is people burn out, because it's like, well, everybody has all these expectations.
Yes.
Bosses have expectations that you're just going to, like, turn this stuff around, and it's super easy, and that's not the case, right? So clearly defining what those, like, getting it into these steps, which DevOps has done a fantastic job, or some workflow that allows you to manage work and then level set expectations and have the business choose what it wants to prioritize, is key in you getting the support that you need from a BI perspective, as well as just being able to articulate how long things are going to take when you deliver. And then your job becomes execution, right? If you say it's going to take, 4 days, you deliver in 4 days, right? And that's your litmus of success. And I think that's where putting rigor around, like, taking some of the DevOps principles, which is also part of data ops here, and introducing those
Yes.
as fast implementations also makes sense, because you're not going to be able to just, like, say, I'm doing data ops, and then, like, introduce a 3-week delay on every report, right? Like, business is going to, like, tell you to do things with that idea.
Well, and that's a huge part too, where I think getting out of the scope of, we've talked about portals, help desk, and requests, where like no one would just work on an app if a new request came into a development team saying new app request, and they had to build a mobile app from the ground up. It would have to go through some rigor, some priorities, some feature sets in terms of what are we going to build, what is the priority, and what are the important features. And I think in the same way, if someone says new report request, right? I don't think it should just follow like, okay, I guess we have 2 weeks to work on this, where there should be some intermediate stage of depending on the request type or the request that comes from the business, does it then go through either like a template or scoping on what's important? Can we identify the priorities and the features?
Mhm.
Does the report itself even meet that priority in working with the business? So then the developers can prioritize what they're going to work on their report rather than just a new report. A new report could take a day, or it could take a week or two if you're building from the ground up. So, and also this goes back to the constant changing goalposts too, where we clearly defining, okay, you want to, based on the request type that comes in, whether it's a Power App, a new feature set in the report, data quality, basically saying, what is the expectations? Here's what the features are that's submitted. And that's what we're working towards.
I'd be interested in like what you guys take on this, right? Like it's very easy. Let me complete that thought. When I've interacted with both sides, working with product for developing and reporting, for as a service, right? As a external facing customer report. You find that you're definitely in these rigor moments. All of this is well planned, all of it's structured, and those product teams are defining what's important and defining the priorities for what they want built.
Yes.
Internally, that doesn't exist, right? Like you work with different teams, or different teams are requesting their needs to you, and they're assigning their priority. It almost seems as though we're missing, either maybe maybe this exists in my experience, I just haven't interacted with it, like a governance piece where all of those requesters should understand, or potentially even have visibility into like what that queue is, and let the business fight it out. Like what
I like
the
that.
business priorities as a whole should dictate, like potentially depending on like what the needs of the teams are, and what are the big movers and shakers, or things that we want to accomplish as far as like big organizational goals. All of those should align, or set the priority for things that get done from a finite number of technical BI folks that have to go build these things, as opposed to what we try to do on the side, which is teach other people how to do those. But there's always going to be requests that come into the team to go build things, but there's there's none of that, like organizing it in a way that you don't have that conflict at some point in time where you're kind of trading off between departments, or somebody has to choose what the priority is.
A couple of things strike me as you make those comments, right? One of them, I think, is to your point directly, is there is not a very clear queue of work that is being worked on, and that is very rarely communicated back to anyone asking information about or project-based information. I think good teams, or in the larger the teams become, you're able to more clearly communicate, okay, here's my backlog of work, here's the projects I'm working on, and when they'll be delivered. There's like more of a roadmap. And this is something that I communicate very clearly to clients who are asking about, what does the Center of Excellence do? I think that's a clear function of people who are participating in the Center of Excellence inside your organization, whether it's the BI Center of Excellence or whatever you want to call it. But that's a team that's taking in those requests and basically grooming them down to list out, okay, here are the projects we're working on. Here's what you asked for. Does this fit into our current workflow? And would anyone need to have the priorities of what that request comes into to the central team would then get funneled up to some sort of executive sponsor. So I think a lot of that effort funnels through there. But what I would also argue too, on smaller organizations, I think this becomes more of a challenge because when there's only one person or two people inside the Center of Excellence, it's harder to distribute that work across. And the needs of the organization are many. And the organization initially with Power BI, or people that are working with Power BI, the organization initially doesn't have enough people to support all the requests. And so the requests keep coming, and it's just a matter of getting things out the door as fast as you possibly can. And I think that's the planning around what work needs to get done to build models and how to release them. Are you using deployment pipelines? How are you going to test, make sure that the data is correct? How are you going to work with multiple teams? I think that becomes more of a challenge the larger the initiative becomes around Power BI. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, related to this topic, I think there's two different competing things. One is you have no structure. Your entire job is a dumpster fire because you just get 100 requests all the time, and you have this backlog that nobody is managing or communicating to the business, and nobody knows. And like, I would say your first job is getting your head around how large that problem is, prioritizing what those things are, and then communicating to your management or the wider organization that there's a deficiency in being able to execute here, right? There are too many requests to have one person solve all these things. So what are the solutions? If it's not hire somebody, like, do we need to train other people? Do we need to hire somebody? Like, get to the point where you're recognized as a development team or person, and there's a finite number of time and resources, so the business has to choose the things it values the most.
Tracking
and then
is
you
so
have
important.
to estimate, and then you have to execute, right? And I think that's the part where you have to have a relationship between the business and yourself, as opposed to just assuming everybody knows all the work that you're doing, because you're not. It doesn't. And that's
You can't
where
assume that.
structures like this and just this one component of it help you manage that much better and deliver in a way that is looked at as a positive thing, to recognize all the work you're doing, as opposed to a negative, like you just can't keep up.
And this is also, I think, why the executive sponsor is so important here, is because there will be completing conflicts between two different teams or two different areas of business. I need data this way, or I need these 5 reports, and another business, I need these reports. Both business units are going to say my reports and my data is most important to them because that's what they care about. So there's only one person or a team of people that can output the information. Someone has to decide, we're going to do this team first and we're going to do this team second because that aligns to our strategic goals of our company. So at some level, someone has to say no, or not now. We will get to it. It's going to be in the queue. And I think to your point there, Seth, like having the business be able to ask for those things is good, but you do need someone at that VP or higher level, that executive sponsor level, that's really able to set direction for that team. So that way you can have, background around what data ops would look like. And then
I mean, but that could also be managed at the team level too, right? It's just operational efficiency, right? Like what can your expectations be of my team? Whether that goes higher, like it can, right? But
I think it should. I think if you read the Microsoft documentation, like they're very clear about like having that executive sponsor is very key to participating in that central BI team or the COE. For whatever that's going to be looking like.
At the same point too, though, like the business is such an essential part, because like, let's talk about all the tests and all the process that you would have if the business doesn't know what the numbers should be. Let's say again, like some of the examples in that DataOps kitchen, like growth targets based on like total sales, or like whatever the customer member count would be, right? If we could just do a count on a data set or count on a table, but it also needs to be verified in some way. So especially with Power BI, is the developer doing all the testing, or because we can use the tools of Power BI, can we utilize a scorecard where, hey, you input what you see the customer count, or whatever the metric is, where that number is coming from, and that's what we'll try to match to.
And that's a good point though, because part of data ops is around the data quality portion, right? So that's and that's where the testing I think comes into place. So like, I mean, you can do the data modeling, you can get it as close as you want, but you need either it's the developer. And again, I think this is back to your point, Seth, right? The organization has to define, okay, where does quality come from? Is there a team that's dedicated to doing data quality and they're figuring things out? And you're basically pushing to that team, okay, this model's ready to go. Check the quality of this report. I think that's something you definitely want to do. It could be even representatives from that business unit. Hey, you've told me what you think we need to do, what we need to do with the data. We've engineered some information in the data model. Here you go, Mr. Business Unit. It's up to you to vet the quality of the data. And I think it really is important from like a data stewardship standpoint, is to get skin in the game from people who are actually going to consume the model, to make sure that they are checking it, like they're looking at it. They're not just sitting there well, this is not right. I can't verify this. Like, you want someone's skin in the game to help get that data model over the
Right.
goalposts. Go check it.
I'm laughing because we should have just put DataOps in intro, because there's like 189 page book, like all this stuff, and we're just like very on the cursory talking through
All the different pieces of it.
components of it. There's obviously a lot in here. Are there any, like, since we're condensed in an intro, are there any core components, Tommy, that like our reflector come out of this that we should be like honed in on or focused?
I would say, I mean, honestly, I would love to see a better, like a platform for testing. But to me, what really stands out is where we can apply this take the DevOps and agile development, is really creating expectations around iterations. What do iterations look like for a report development, for a Power BI developer? What does a feature set or feature request look like for a new report? All from the data model all the way to the bookmarks or what they actually want to see. And what do, in a sense, those quick wins or in terms of the output really look like. One of the big things too we didn't mention is, what about ROI on a report? What about ROI on the output that we're doing? How do we actually measure that? And I think that's something that we really don't do, or at least we don't hear enough about. Is we're building this particular report or this model. Can we estimate what we think, or can we then measure what the ROI is of building it?
I think I like this section of the book until you're kind of to jump onto that point as well, Tommy.
Yeah.
Around 30 page, I guess page 35. Data ops is just not DevOps for data, and so I do really like this diagram that they produce here. There's a development side of things, and then there's an operational side of things, right? You have and I think when I think of data, I think of really high level here. There's a pipeline of how we're getting information, connecting to a source or sources. Inside that source, we're connecting to that source. We're doing some kind of ideating, development, engineering work on top of that data. And then you're moving that data from, okay, now that I've got the development done, I need to then productionalize or distribute or move this out into an area where more people can consume it. And then ultimately, the end of what all we're doing here is add value. So
Yes.
we're basically starting with data, and at the end of the pipeline, there is real value being added for someone. And that could be value in I just need access to the information, or I need insights, or something I can go look at a single visual and take action on immediately, or go do something else because that's going to trigger my action. Like, one thing that I look at very frequently is simple example, our YouTube analytics. What are we doing? Do we have any good thumbnails? Are there any videos that are more popular than others? What did we do? So I'm always constantly looking at that, trying to say, okay, what actions can I take away from insights about the information that I can go do to produce the value that I want long term? Or that could be in anything. So I think the data to value story is what we're talking about, and the data ops is just a kind of an interesting way of incorporating techniques from agile. It's incorporating things from a development pipeline. It's talking about operational things. So there's a lot of good concepts that come along with this. The point where I just think about it on this one is sometimes I get overwhelmed by all of this, because I think there can be so much. You can go so far into the weeds on things here, that it's sometimes it's daunting to figure out which is the most important pieces of data ops that you need to pluck and use inside any one of your processes, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, overall for me, I like the framework of this. Having guiding principles of things that you would want to keep in mind or implement in different ways is hugely valuable. How you go about doing that, I think, is the challenge here, because in any process, and if we're talking about a BI team, the more complicated that process, the more prone to error that process is, right? So just because you found a way to do some one-off niche thing, have I trained my developers to do that?
Right.
Do they understand how to use that tool? Like, you're adding complexity to all of this because we're forced to, versus DevOps being, I have a code base, I have structures and these systems that are designed to make this simple, automate, deploy, right?
Mhm.
Like, there are gates and that I work within an ecosystem. Right now, we don't have an ecosystem. So I think that's what makes it challenging. I think, honestly, I'd like to spend more time talking about this in certain like areas and snippets, because I think all of these principles make a ton of sense. Even as I was reading through them, all of the challenges that I've had, even recently, like, all of them are repeated over and
Mhm.
over and over.
Mhm.
And you can find yourself doing the same mistakes, which is also justification for why this makes sense to do it up front. It's
Agreed.
just it's just figuring out where and how to implement in such a way that the business says, yeah, like, either I want to invest in this thing that you're telling me, or I'm willing to not invest in it and take the risk of not doing that. And I think ultimately, the
Ooh,
more I
that's a
get
good
into
point.
conversations around why we force certain standards on teams, or um, go down these paths, is it's not it's not my job to like tell the business what it has to invest in, but it is my job to tell them, like, what are the things that they could do if they wanted the best product, right? And we talk
Mhm.
about this all the time. Am I producing the 100%? The answer to that question is no. Like, 99% of the time, it's no, because to get to 100% takes, an
Whole
extra
lot of
2
effort.
weeks, right?
Yeah.
How can, like, business is usually, I want 95%. Okay, well, that's only 1 week, right? We can knock off all of this other time,
Hmm.
but understand you're not getting 100%. And what that means is you're opening the door to 5% risk. If you're okay with that, then fine. We
Move
don't
on.
need to do this
Yes.
thing, right?
I
And I
like
think
that.
that's where that conversation has to come into play when you're talking about these ideas of creating the best and most reproducible thing with a ton of manual steps in between, right? And a bunch of time investment. Is that worth the business? And that's where I think diving more into this for me is going to be valuable, to, like, hey, how does this relate to, things I could further develop within my team to make it better, versus what are the pain points or pinch points where I have to say, I'm going to have to ask a business whether or not they want us to invest in this, because, like, this one's going to take a lot more time than the other ones would.
I'm trying to materialize what you're saying there. That's a couple key nuggets for me. It sounds like, or I feel like what I'm kind of landing on is data ops is a process of balancing or reducing risk.
Mhm.
I think that kind of feels like where I'm going to
That's
land on some
that's
like part of this
yeah,
topic.
that's a
But
that's
I
good.
like this topic. I think this is really good. I think the trend of the technology is the trend of Power BI. It is very business user centric. It's like, for the frontline workers. It's for people who are like very comfortable in Excel, people who are able to do data things on their own, giving more data power to the people. Right. I think that's great. But I think with this comes risks that, if without a rigorous process, you're going to get a wide variety of answers to various questions because the data can be manipulated any which way. So I think the further we push this data into the hands of the business side, because the technology is increasing, making it easier for you to get to that answer, the more it'll be challenging to balance those risk elements. Cool. Really good topic today. Sorry, I was a little bit slow getting started here today, but we got it done. For those of you who have been joining the podcast, we appreciate you and your listenership. We would love for you to share or distribute this podcast. If you have someone that you like or found someone that you're working through with data ops. Excuse me, I had a sneeze. If someone you're working with data ops, feel free to share them this episode. We'd love for you to share this with somebody else. That's really only our main request is if you like the content we produce here, share with somebody else and let them know that you found some value from it, and build a process around it. Build a process around your sharing. Data ops, how you share, so that way people can get regular and high quality updates of your
How you
content.
produce.
Yeah, how do you produce good recommendations? Anyways, with that, Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find the podcast anywhere it's available: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Overcast. Make sure to subscribe and leave a rating. If you want to join the conversation live, you can do so every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central.
Thank you all very much, and we'll catch you next time.